I'd like to welcome everyone to the start of the week of postgraduate MArch reviews. It's an exciting week to always have the opportunity to begin. And so Housing and Urbanism always enjoys this sort of bookending moment that starts the first session of the completing work of 16 months for all of the postgraduate programs in Master of Architecture. One of the things that is always a pleasure about that is that we have this chance to share a kind of larger school spirit of all the different programs that present, and they show both their unity and distinctiveness. The Housing and Urbanism program is one of the oldest programs in the school, together with what was previously Energy and now Sustainable Environmental Design. And it began in a period when housing seemed to be a critical issue. Funny, that topic doesn't seem to go away. But the program has evolved quite a great deal over the 30 plus years that it's been in operation, and design is much more central now. Now, within our program, we always take the point of view that urbanism is really a trio of three different kinds of issues, putting a project at the center of urban transformation, the transformation of a definable geographical area, and something that harnesses what we might think of as the drivers of change. And so we ask all of our students to really look at projects that seem to have the kind of power to nurture transformation. And that gives students the opportunity to think about the way in which they might place their project within a tradition or a trajectory or a set of comparisons. But it also asks them to think a little bit about what is a meaningful geographical area. And another aspect of this then is that these sorts of geographical and project-based sets of questions are tied together with who the actors might be and who would be driving change under today's circumstances. And so there you will see repeating themes, an interest in care, in well-being as being things that are driving new value propositions. There you will also see interest in sharing, affordability, crossovers between living and working. And so these kinds of issues are central to the program, and we try to ask students to bring all of these things together. But we ask them to do it within a very short time frame. So they begin their thesis work not early in the year, but early in the academic year, but just at the start of the autumn term. So they have an opportunity to go through other themes during the course of their studies and then turn to a brief and a thesis project at the beginning of the autumn term. And we also are looking not so much for final resolution within the student work. We enjoy it when it gets there, but the key aspect of the student work is that it should properly identify the kinds of questions that demand judgment in design terms, and that enable students to think kind of across these different challenges, how to evaluate different sorts of projects within a series or a grouping, but also to think about the way in which the key questions might arise. So the sorts of conversation we would like at the end of each of the students' presentations would be something that opens up the kinds of implications, the sorts of future thinking that we would like to see, but oriented towards next steps. We're not sort of looking far into a far distant future, but what are the near-term responses that we might look for in terms of urban challenges and the role of architecture in shaping new kinds of questions and design trajectories. Now, I would like to give an outline of the day's proceedings. We will see 3 students in the morning and 3 students in the afternoon. And they've both panels have been selected to sort of show the range of work. One thing that is new within the program this year is that we're starting to see a stronger interest in adaptive reuse. And so both the first presentation of the morning session and the first presentation of the afternoon session will show a way in which we're opening that up. We can talk more about what that is doing to the program perhaps later. But these projects are by their very nature, because we're young at it, they're a bit more speculative. So we've given Frank Alston Ball the challenge of opening this up in the morning, but I'll come back to that in a minute. I'd like to introduce our jurors. We have Joe Sutherland, who's a director at Howard Tompkins, Shamisa Oneka, who very happily for us came from the GLA, and we would like to open this conversation up with you very much. We've had a lot of work with Louise Duggan, your colleague there at GLA in the past. We're delighted that you can now carry on that tradition with us. And Katerina Borsi, who is an associate professor at University of Nottingham and has been a former external examiner of Projective Cities, another postgraduate program here at the AA, and directs or is deputy director of their research quality at University of Nottingham in the School of Engineering. So we're delighted to have a panel that takes us across the board in terms of academia, government, and practice, and that's the kind of conversation that we're looking for within our program. Now, our first presenter, Frank Alston Ball, has done something a bit intriguing and unusual. And looking at the Docklands area, Frank has noticed that there's a lot of overcapacity in the financial services towers that dominate the Docklands skyline and groundscape. And he's been rather intrigued by the way in which we might look at an approach to re-qualifying those towers as residential and repair and making spaces that we might actually even pair up with something that is a more typical and old-fashioned approach to adaptive reuse in a church about 10 minutes walk away. And so looking at these two things in combination for the way in which they dovetail as part of a larger strategy is the starting point of Frank's topic. Frank.
Thank you. So, hi everyone. My name is Frank. I'm, as Larry mentioned, beginning with an adaptive reuse project called Urban Repair. It is taking a stance to adapting office space in Canary Wharf and an existing community center in South Poplar, similar to how a bicycle mechanic might approach a set of problems. And I'd like to start just looking at Greater London. And I think one of the first things that always kind of stands out to me is just how much the actual morphology of Canary Wharf as a kind of quote-unquote central business district mirrors the center of London, or the city of London, where financial activity has historically occurred. And that also makes it obvious that it's really a satellite central business district. It's not the business district. And I think that kind of mischaracterization has prevented an understanding that it could change. And it's made Canary Wharf, which is so well positioned between some of the more residential fabric of the city, static. And I think if we just get rid of that understanding that it's only a business district, we can start to think of how it integrates into wider London. And That's so important because we want to treat it as a neighborhood that is a fully autonomous urban quarter, something that provides all of the services of a city, or I'm sorry, all of the services of a neighborhood, living, working, services, and it could begin to work almost as a link. Oh, I'm sorry. It could begin to work as a link between other developments that are coming in. The sheer size of Canary Wharf makes it like this brute force driver of change. It forces so much investment in the area that there's just constant proposals for more master planning around it. And so I want to think of how, again, we can use this as a way to start to bring in different activities. And funnily enough, I started to look at a deconsecrated church building just to the north of it, which has certain similarities. Mostly morphologically, one thing you can start to tell is that there are different, in a regular neighborhood, like South Poplar, there are pockets of kind of reprieve and slowness where people can start to identify almost an ownership, and they feel more like they can carve out a space for themselves. And in certain ways, that does actually exist in Canary Wharf, but the sort of detail treatments, I'll come back. The approach to design that's been used at Canary Wharf just only makes it look like you can go 1,000,000 miles an hour. You have to be commuting in and out. It's all business. There is no slowdown. But again, I think there are actual little pockets where those moments can happen. And I think that by unlocking those moments and sort of breaking things down into a more human scale, we're able to activate Canary Wharf again as this linkage between other developments that are coming in. And sort of lastly, this is timely because Canary Wharf is at a low occupancy rate. Even after the pandemic, we would have expected numbers to return much higher. I think right now it's about 15% vacant. And even those numbers are kind of hard to pin down because Canary Wharf is so fiercely protective of their space. They've always prevented this kind of alternate reading of Canary Wharf. But and now that they are in this sort of crisis where they need more investment in their space, we can start to change that perception. So again, I'm looking at a deconsecrated church building in South Poplar and then 2 partially or completely vacant office towers in Canary Wharf. And I think they both have very similar approaches to adaptive reuse that help inform the other. And together, they can help us create a full neighborhood of about 60 hectares. This is that deconsecrated church building I'd mentioned. It gets used as a community center, but it's just sort of being filled in. They whether it's a daycare center or a senior center, most of the time there's no real read to the actual spaces, and you wind up with junk kind of pushed around the edges or things on the outside. So I would like to improve this with just a very simple move, reading the geometry to expand it. And I'm going to come back to this idea more later because the kind of heart of it, of this project, is across the street or across the tracks here. And that's in these 2 office towers, one of them being 20 Canada Square and 25 Churchill Place. And so this is, again, starting to take that different formal approach to announcing it as a new type of neighborhood that's not strictly business or commercial. these are more diagrammatic floor plans. There's much more detail to them. But I wanted to begin by just simply reading that 20 Canada Square, again, the building on the left, relies on this very regular grid. And 25 Churchill Place is a little bit less regular. And this allows for a much more structured approach on one, and then the opportunity to play with things like diagonal and more sort of free-form geometry on the right. And again, sort of taking this mechanic approach, the idea of taking a building apart down from its facade to its structure to its core, and kind of looking at these pieces and trying to understand new components that could be slotted in. You know, what is actually compatible with this type of structure? How could it start to work? And that dissection of the building comes from, you know, a very close read of it, and it implies this, or it sort of by default makes you take a very tectonic approach to the materiality, and I think results in a much more juxtaposed sort of product. And this is looking again at number 20. So kind of evaluating the fitness, if you will, of the building to be converted, or the buildings, and looking a little more at these two different strategies. Again, I'm using a rigid kind of, or a regular approach to inserting units that are divided by a party wall, and that works with the building's egress, and there's also a approach here that allows light to enter into the residential areas and other programs to take place central. There's light that accesses the peripheral areas. In the building, again on the right, number 25, I'm thinking of it, I'm taking more of an approach where there could be almost prefabricated units, things that are components that are given to me, and I am making work within the existing grid. So this is the strategy for the more kind of regular approach, and it's trying to take advantage of the generous deep floor plate that is common in office buildings. And so I've developed a system that's basically the diagram for both of these projects, or for all of these buildings, where you have a 2-to-1 ratio of space, where half of it can be dedicated to living, again, kind of at the perimeter. And then the further you move from the perimeter, the more kind of slowed down, less light intensive services occur. Additionally, these are designed to be units that support themselves and are separate from the building's existing mechanical, electrical, and plumbing systems. So laid out onto a building, it starts to create these gradients of space where there's living around the periphery and more sort of more functions on the interior that are less dedicated to living. I'm calling them activity or service. It could even just be a place to keep your junk. And then this is an illustrative plan of what that starts to look like. And so again, looking at the facade of 20 Canada Square and then 25 Churchill as it's been reconstructed essentially. So at number 25, these are the kind of components that I started with, where I'm trying to create a more communal approach to domesticity. We're able to combine these units into an L shape. And you could even begin to think of the smaller units as like a beginning step, a first sort of approach that would then combine into larger communal units. And as mentioned, these work slotted into the existing building. So what you wind up with are units that could shift a little bit and still align kind of with things like plumbing, as they have this extra room to play with. And that read, or that idea came from a read of the building's facades and ultimately their section and the relationship to each other, which starts to imply how eventually they may even connect into a bigger link to new development, again, occurring to the right. And so, again, this is my standard sort of approach to a unit, and that is very similar to how I'm approaching the church, where the deconsecrated church, where the structural bay starts to be repeated and form these gradients of space. Again, sort of reading back from my understanding of the office buildings, you can take a tectonic sort of stance and see how different uses might actually be prescribed by different types of construction, where something a little more like historic or sacred becomes a more intimate, deep area, and then things along the perimeter are used or receive a different type of treatment. So, thank you.
Thank you. So thank you. Really, really, really interesting to see housing and urbanism grappling with material and structure and adaptive reuse. And of course, I mean, as we all know, it's sort of important and current. So I think it's been really interesting to think about bringing the rethinking of existing buildings in conjunction with the urban question. I think that's really, really rich. If I just take it away from your own project, I'm going to come back to your project. You know, I think it's a really interesting question you're posing, because in a way, of course, it's Canary Wharf, but that situation applies almost across the world, as we know. You know, these sort of concentrations of not very efficient towers, which are now half empty. I think that's something we have to address, and often they are concentrated in monofunctionality. And I think I really enjoyed the way when you sort of showed the urban plan with the adjacent, you know, you sort of showed synergies almost, or things that are happening. I think that kind of thing would be interesting. I think it also would be interesting to scale it up, not you as in your project, but in principle to have a scale where, you know, you show Canary Wharf and it's not just the adjacent squares, but in a way, if one thinks about it, it'd be really interesting to zoom out to the next scale up and sort of look at the distribution of services and other buildings that could sort of change and adapt and sort of see how things could be clustered. I think that's really, really rich, so really interesting. I think in terms of your towers, I think the interesting thing is then if you work with material and structure and adaptation, it's been a long time that I've been planning these buildings, you know, but I think the 9-meter grid is, of course, the standard grid for any kind of financial building. Yeah, so in a way that makes it reasonably flexible and reasonably cheap, but I think it's also not that difficult to change it. Yeah, so I think, you know, it'd be interesting to think about the floor plan. I like the way in which you had your threshold strips and then the amenities, but it's almost like it also would be interesting to sort of think a bit more aggressively, let's say, about this really, really deep floor plan versus the individual unit. You know, I'm not suggesting everything needs to be co-housing, but effectively, you called it like a standard unit. I think, you know, you had a strip which sort of living, whatever, but effectively these sort of seemed individual small flats, and then you had a block of an amenity. And I think it also would be really interesting to think about what could we do in the depth of the plan independent of how I want to live within my own walls, if you see what I mean. You know, how much space would I really need for myself, and how much could I share, and how much could I work in the depth of the plan, or would I be happy to cook in the depth of the plan? Would I be happy to have a sleeping box in the depth of the plan? So I think, you know, if one thinks this further, it'd be really interesting to sort of look at precedents that sort of occupy, for example, I think it's Mehr als Wohnen in Zurich or something, where they have a very deep floor plan, have these clusters, for example. So I think it'd be interesting to think about as a series of experimentations across scales, where you break apart the single unit a little bit more. For example, if it were me, the area around the perimeter, which is of course very precious, if you think about La Canton Vassal, you could also almost think that as a shared space. Do we really need to live? Does it need to be my private space, or could it be shared? But this is all, this is not a critique on your project, but I'm just trying to think, okay, what could that mean? Where would we begin to think differently, maybe also about planning regulations? A lot of the stuff has to do with fire distances, with sort of light and whatever. Do we need light everywhere? Of course, we would like to. Anyway, but I think there's a whole range of questions it poses, which are really, really interesting thing. The only thing is, it would have been really good to show the grid in your plans when you change it, to be frank, because I think that's the starting point. And any adaptation you make, an interruption or your rotations, of course you can have transfer structures, but that's really, really ridiculously expensive and complicated. Yeah. So I think with your rotations, again, sort of thing, I'm not sure if I really think the rotations do all that much apart from being rotated more towards the sun. I mean, I don't know, but I think it's also that, you have clearly on the plan you had more space you could be using. So I'm not sure if that's the most obvious thing to rotate, would be sort of my initial comment. Anyway, I'm going to stop talking now for a while, sorry.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Frank, for your presentation and for taking us through that kind of the narrative for your project. I question what the driver is for this and kind of who is enacting this transformation. So I think the first thing when I kind of hear you talk about these sort of redundant financial buildings in the city, and we know that is kind of recurrent across London and across cities across the world. It really made me wonder, what is the future trend and trajectory for spaces of work, and also what is the need in terms of housing, and how are you bringing that together through your proposal? So I think some kind of understanding of and analysis of those kind of existing sectors in that area or in those buildings, what's the history of those buildings, and how can that start to inform a position on what their future should be as well. What are the industries that are going on around there? What kind of sectors could be taking up those spaces? And I think in terms of the driver for this, are you proposing that it's a kind of compulsory purchase of office spaces, not just within these kind of two buildings that you're proposing, but on a sort of London-wide scale? Are you proposing that, okay, the Mayor of London should take a really strong position on this kind of vacancy and the waste of space in light of a housing emergency and the kind of housing crisis that we have? And do we say that as the public, we are compulsorily purchasing these spaces and providing the housing that we need for the people that need it? Are you kind of taking that kind of stance here? I'm not saying you have to, but it feels quite polite in lots of different ways. It feels quite polite in the way that when you go to your floor plans, there's a sort of nice partition where you've left the office as it is on one side, and then you're doing something kind of fun on your side, like why not the whole building? Why not the whole floor plate? And why not the whole city? Mm-hmm. I think that it gives you then the opportunity to think about things in the kind of planning and regulatory frameworks, like permitted development rights, and what could be done within the current framework, and where you think through your project you would like to kind of push that forward, and where you can be more speculative and propositional about that too. So we know now for things like office to resi conversions, we have permitted development rights, but then how does that interface with things like building regulations, where we know, you need 2 staircases for a building over 18 meters, which might work quite well because I think there are 2 staircases, 2 cores within that office building that you showed.
Yes.
But just thinking about the kind of different layers of kind of policy and regulatory frameworks that you can work within and that you can play with and that maybe you can push in certain ways, I think is a real opportunity in the project that you've chosen to set out.
Right.
And then I think finally, a point about that's a bit more human scale, on sort of like who would live here. And if we've taken that stance, well, I have in my mind taken that stance that it's a CPO, it's a compulsory purchase, then what kinds of support services would people in real need of housing need in that neighborhood? Like, what are the kind of services and amenities in a residential neighborhood that are needed that don't necessarily exist in Canary Wharf as they are, and how would you make those connections through public realm, through other spaces in the community? And I think that the typology of housing that you're proposing needs to be a little bit more specific as well. And I think having that understanding of who would live there will help you to think more about what kinds of homes we need to create for people. Are all the typologies we have the ones that we need for the future? I don't necessarily think so. And you've got this opportunity to create a future typology for the need that we have.
Right.
So thinking about the kind of unit sizes, the size of those homes, how much of it is shared, how much, I think we spoke about that before, how much is shared within the kind of context of living. I think, there's ways that you can really challenge and propose new things in that regard. But I think the premise and what you've set out is really interesting, but I think you could be a bit bolder in lots of different directions.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I'm going to see where I start. There's lots of interest. It's raised so many interesting issues, and as has been said, actually, it's a really the conversion of office buildings may become a real reality, and so I'm going to comment on the detail of that. But first of all, I think just what I felt was really interesting looking at Canary Wharf and having gone on quite a few walks around there in the summer. What I felt was missing, and I think would be really useful to see, is just a bit of an understanding of the place as a place, because actually it's really busy. At weekends, hugely busy. I mean, people sailing, that it's actually quite wonderful, and yet you've got this bizarre relationship of shops and all that activity happening underground. So the sort of street activity and the things that make a sort of great new neighbourhood are sort of removed. So that sort of sense of, as you say, speed or is partly because there's a very clear split of uses. And I think that would be something that would be useful to just to consider as part of changing the area with housing, and how those streets could change and what kind of neighbourhood it could become as a mixed-use neighbourhood. But I think I would say would be probably one of the biggest challenges of Canary Wharf is in terms of how you deal with the sort of subterranean world of shops. But sure. And that's one thing. I think just commenting on the conversion of sort of offices, I wrote down the sort of key things. Well, where did I write them down? So, the key issues of a sort of office block compared to a housing block is as you pointed out, the really deep plan. You've also got really high ceiling height, so the floor to floor is much higher than you would have, and then interesting, the idea of sort of inserting units because you've got that height. But you've also got I wasn't quite clear about what the distance is between the two office buildings. So office buildings tend to be built much closer together than housing permits. So what are those sort of overlooking issues? Key thing, office spaces or buildings don't have external space. So you did sort of refer to that, but actually whether it's shared amenity or private amenity, it's obviously a key sort of element. And I'm sort of breaking this down because these are in a way the sort of components of the challenge and where the differences are if you were starting from scratch. And it sort of helps identify the opportunities, but it also helps maybe from that start to think about what type of homes are most suitable. So, and then another key thing is the quality of life, which is, there's a big drive now for all homes to be dual aspect. So that's proving to be a really interesting challenge in housing. But also then, because that's about ventilation, it's so that although it's useful to see ways of challenging the depth of the plan in terms of what you might provide in terms of uses that are in darker spaces. Another way that you could look at that, which I think you do with the sort of shifted geometry, is actually what that does do is it starts to move away from a perimeter that's continuous and brings light into the depth of the plan. And I think that's probably where you've got great opportunity, even with the ceiling height, so not necessarily cutting the floor plates, but actually can that bring light in? Does that enable units to be dual aspect? Does that actually solve that as a problem? So the advantage of the floor-to-floor heights helps you do more innovative things with the facade. So I'd say that I can't remember which the number was, but when we looked on the left, the left of the plan, right, where you had the sort of more single perimeter, you have given yourself a huge problem to solve, which is this big, dark, deep plan, which perhaps is you shouldn't be the problem you're solving. It should be that the configuration of the units and your approach to the facade, or creating sort of external courtyards, or what will actually help solve that problem through the sort of the way you locate the homes. I'm just checking my notes. I can't see them. But I think so actually, and I think the key thing that I thought was actually that the rotations were quite interesting. Whether that's about externally, expressing them, but actually how you might create external gardens in the facade, which also help distinguish them as sort of as homes. But there are then, like, I don't want to be this sort of boring pragmatist, but the other key huge issue which has been referred to is cores and circulation and fire escape. And in a way, I think one of the first things you would sort of need to consider in a block like this is how does that work? Because that might have such a fundamental impact on what you can do. Can you even comfortably have the sort of the office spaces? Because were the office spaces and the housing sort of sharing cores? That's what I wasn't quite clear on.
On one strategy, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's where that might prove to be quite challenging. I'm not a complete expert on it, but I think what I couldn't quite follow on a zoomed out scale was the relationship between the sort of adapting the sort of community space and then the adapting of the homes. And in a way, I think that scale of what is a place, what are the streets like, what are the relationships between neighbourhoods is a sort of felt like that's a sort of scale that was missing. We sort of went into the detail. So it would be helpful to really think about how Canary Wharf becomes a different place.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. We had some amazing feedback. I think also the policy measures, I think, are critical to how you can imagine the possibility for change. So I think that's something to really take on board. And then, Joanna's offered you some really also excellent design advice. I suppose I'd like to approach this from the position of a thesis. So in so many respects, this is a project that identifies your priorities within the realm of housing and urbanism. And I think it's a really good moment to start to distill what you think the appropriate urbanism is. And I think perhaps you've opened up, and I think that you put this very well, Larry, a lot of questions, which is what you've been asked to do. But to a large extent, maybe there's more questions that are answerable. And if we start with the community center, you identify a looseness and a messiness that may actually be key to the success of that space. Mm-hmm. You then identify, I suppose, an over-provision of commercial space at a moment of, doubt in the future of kind of financial office environments. And then we talk about, I suppose, an integration of loose fit spaces that, I suppose, characterize a normal residential neighborhood as opposed to these financial districts. That's quite a lot to take on. And then underpinning this is adaptive reuse, which is fundamentally an issue to do with sustainability. So my question is, where are your priorities? Because it would be really helpful within the structure of a thesis to say, you have a lot of questions, call them research questions, that are thrown up both by your research but also by your design provocations. And then how do you prioritize those questions? So if the primary objective is from a sustainability or an energy perspective, then how do you do as little as possible? You would never dismantle and reconstruct these buildings. You just wouldn't. To what extent, from a policy perspective, is this a permanent reuse or is this an intermittent reuse? Is this an in-between use for these spaces? In that case, what is the future in your mind of a kind of corporate environment? There's very, very little research done into the typology of the office. There's maybe 4 or 5 decent pieces of work on it. They've emerged as a kind of a type that is fully accepted, that we don't seem to question, that have particular rules in terms of grids, in terms of cores, in terms of security, in terms of relationship to a public realm, that really haven't shifted for decades. We're in an environment where we work very differently. We're in an environment where we used to talk about live-work spaces. Now we're kind of talking about work-live. So how does the office become more like home? And all of these things are embedded within the context of your thesis. But I think it would be helpful, even at this stage, to say, okay, how does that community space act as a very simple demonstration of a deep plan space, where fundamentally the problem is storage? Fundamentally, you're using the threshold, or if you really had this as a project with a minimal budget, you would go in and design some really great storage that would enable them flexible use of that internal environment, that would occupy the threshold and create a dark external boundary. And then you would almost produce the opposite within the residential realm. You would bury all that core and service in a way that perhaps opened up or create the rotation internally within the body of the block, that maybe turned double glazed units into single glazed units, that created a kind of winter garden along a Lakatomba style strategy, that would have a kind of lightness of touch where you would talk about inside and outside, porous and non-porous, rigid. And I think that might be a helpful way of thinking through the things you already have, and perhaps some of those things become footnotes to a wider argument. Mm-hmm. A lot of rich material, quite a big thing to bite off. But thanks so much.
Thank you.
There was a kind of barely legible interest registered in Frank's presentation. There was a plan or two that showed lots of bicycles laying around. Yeah, and this starting point of bicycle repair was something that was very close to Frank's heart early on. And so coming back to your question, where is the priority? I'm not entirely sure, but Frank's stripped it out for this presentation. But I think in many ways it was the starting point of his approach. And it touches a little bit, Shimizu, onto your question, who would be the interesting actors? And Frank's initial idea was that the interesting actors would be someone like a bicycle repairman or a bicycle repair woman, because it turns out that Frank's sister is such a skilled person. And the kind of thinking was that an economy of repair that might be very similar to the way in which we work increasingly on bicycles around the city, and the little shops appear in so many places now, that could be a way of beginning to think about a broadening of a repair-based economy. Now, that also led to a series of thoughts about frame and component that was, I think, also motivating Frank. But it raises, I think, a question that sort of, if I triangulate between Ingrid, your questions, and Shimizu's, to what extent do we expect some of the key service providers for both home and office to begin to change their strategy in light of the availability of office space like this? Now, on the one hand, we might imagine that a clever housing service provider might look for opportunities within office buildings, but it may even be interesting to speculate on how work is changing and how that might be a way of attracting a different kind of workforce back into the office space because it's a more exciting place to be. And so one of the things that we might ask is if there is a compulsory purchase order, who might the civic organizations be that would start to pull together interested actors in the realm of a repair-based economy? And how could that then be consolidated into a more consistent approach to the redevelopment of the building?
I'd really like to see some of that repair happening. We did a study a year or so ago on Leuven and their circular economy. So they have really a really interesting scaled set of repair initiatives, from repair cafes to what becomes the Makelierplek, which has taken over one of the old Stella Artois breweries as a temporary measure, but they have theatre projects, architects, they have teenagers who go and help old people learn digital skills. It's an incredible range of, it's 42 different kind of players within that particular field that's based originally on a hacker culture. But it's a very specific kind of space. They're only going to be there for 2 or 3 years, and they're maximizing their use of it. They're involving other parts of the city. They're actually linked to a material bank. So it's a complete metabolism, and those things take up very specific kinds of space. I don't think you're going to make a whole community of repair people. So, if it is compulsory purchase order, then this is people who have to be in this part of the city for whatever reason. And that's quite an interesting range, and it requires facilities and storage and different kinds of light and different types of thermal environments to be able to work within these spaces are really critical to how we see urbanism. But then fundamentally, when you're talking about housing, are we talking about a place where people can sleep and raise their children or look after elderly parents, or are we talking about a purchasable asset? And that is a really important question, I think, probably for all of the students.
No, I just... But thank you.
Yeah, I think, one other thing to add on that, in terms of who ultimately would lease or own the building and manage it. And that's where I think there are challenges around the combination of office and housing, because I think there would need to be a sort of clear line of ownership or lease ownership, and so that is quite complex unless you find the agent, the client or the person that's willing to sort of develop that as something that's unique that then they manage. But I don't know of any right now. So that would be, in a way, finding the sort of people that see the opportunity there would be absolutely key to enabling that to be a success. But all the interesting things about repair and everything and how that might make use of ground floor spaces and activity would be really interesting to see.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you, everyone.
Do you have any other responses to any of these points that you want to draw out, Frank?
No, I think everybody did get a good read on it. I'm happy about that. I really appreciate all the feedback. I agree with, there's so many points that, I would love to get into more. I'm sorry, maybe I can't order them right now, but just thank you again.
Yeah. Thanks, Frank. Thank you very much.